Growing up, my sister and I always liked to play school. Well, we didn't play school like normal school today. We would always pretend like we were in a one-room schoolhouse. I was usually the only teacher in the room, and there were kids of all ages. My brother usually played the bad kid. But what would spark this imagination in such young children, you might ask? And that would be the love for our favorite TV series, Little House on the Prairie. Like most good TV series, there's an even better book series behind that. And the author behind this book is Laura Ingalls Wilder. Today we're going to take a look at Laura Ingalls Wilder's life. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls was born on February 7th, 1867 in Pepin, Wisconsin. She was the second child of Carolyn and Charles Ingalls. The family had 5 children. The parents had 5 children. Charles and Carolyn Ingalls were the parents, and there were 4 girls and 1 boy. Laura's siblings were Mary, Carrie, and Grace. Mary was the oldest sibling, but she became blind at age 14. All the way up until she became blind, her and Laura were best friends. But then Laura became good friends with Carrie. Grace was much younger than the other siblings. They also had a brother, Charles Jr., named Freddie, but he died when he was only 9 months old. The family traveled a lot while Laura was growing up. In 1869, they moved from Pepin, Wisconsin to Kansas. Laura was only 2 at this time. In 1874, they moved to Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Then in 1876, they moved to Burr Oak, Iowa. Then they moved back to Walnut Grove in 1877. And finally, in 1879, they moved to the Dakota Territories. They ended up in DeSmet, South Dakota. DeSmet is where Carolyn and Charles remained the rest of their lives. Growing up, Laura loved listening to her pa's stories. He would tell them stories when they weren't busy, and she loved listening to them. Her travels definitely influenced her education. When they were not traveling at a town, they would go to school. But because they traveled a lot, they were mostly self-taught. Laura taught herself most of the things that she knew. She did receive her teaching certificate at just age 15. Now, this wasn't something that she wanted to do necessarily, but out of necessity. Mary was in blind school and they needed money to pay for that, and so Laura contributed by teaching. She taught at 15, and she taught for 3 years in a one-room schoolhouse. She then married Almanzo Manly Wilder, she called him Manly, on August 25th, 1885. She then quit teaching because she wanted to help him on the farm. They had 2 children, Rose Wilder and a little boy that was unnamed. He died shortly after he was born. They then moved for the final time to Mansfield, Minnesota in 1894. Now, during this time, she kept a journal, and this was very significant in her writing career because she sent these writings of all the different places they went to the DeSmet paper, and they published it, and this became her first published writings. Well, during her time in Minnesota, Almanzo and her came to Rocky Ridge. Rocky Ridge was a farm that they made, and they were getting older, and so they hired a bunch of people to help them build Rocky Ridge. Her daughter influenced her to write. Laura had some extra time on her hands, and her daughter encouraged her to write down those stories of her growing up and all her travels. And she did, and she wrote her first autobiography, Pioneer Girl, in 1920. but this wasn't published yet. It was very historical based, very fact based, but nobody really liked it as a book for children to read, so they did not publish it. So Laura didn't give up though. She rewrote the books and she changed the books to create real characters. And this is where we get the Little House books. The first Little House book was in 1932, and this was Little House in the Big Woods. You see, as she was writing her books, she went back and retraced her childhood. In 1932, she wrote Little House in the Big Woods. This was about her time in Wisconsin, and because she was so young, most of the time in here was spent with Pa's writings and what Pa would teach them through the stories. That was what that book was about. In 1933, Farmer Boy came out, and that was about Almanzo's childhood. In 1935, Little House on the Prairie came out, and that was about the time in Kansas. We'll actually read a little bit from that book in just a few minutes. In 1937, On the Banks of Plum Creek came out. Now, this is the book where a lot of the TV shows is about, because this is about the time in Walnut Grove. And in 1939, By the Shores of Silver Lake came out. In 1940, The Long Winter came. And this was a book that was about the very depressing winter they had. There was little food, there was little money, and this is a very hard winter for them. Then in 1941, Little Town on the Prairie came out. And then in 1943, These Happy Golden Years came, and this was a book about Almanzo and Laura's marriage. The series was reprinted in 1953, and the illustrations were done by Garth Williams. In 1949, Almanzo died, but Laura remained in Rocky Ridge for the rest of her life until February 10th, 1957, when Laura died. But her legacy still continued. Rose published her mother's last book in 1962, and this book was On the Way Home. On the Way Home was those journal articles, the newspaper articles that she wrote while traveling to Rocky Ridge. She took those and compiled them into a book and wrote On the Way Home. In 1974, a television series developed, and this was the Little House on the Prairie books. Children today still enjoy her books because they're so exciting, and boys and girls of all ages can enjoy them. Let's take an evaluation of her works. Let's look at the positives first. There were good morals and traits taught in these books. You could see that there was things that Laura had to decide, and there were good choices that were made during these books. We also see that it creates a desire to learn about the West. Kids want to hear and see about things in this book, about things of the West. And there was a sense of Christian influence seen. The family went to church. The family prayed before meals. And you could see some Christian influence influenced her books. But there are some constructive things about her books. There was some details that were not historically accurate. And these are things that as you come through them, you'll just have to talk to your kids about and say, well, actually this happened during this time. And that's something as teachers you would have to be aware of. Also, there's an unclear view of a Christian life. We don't really know if Laura Ingalls Wilder was necessarily Christian. You could see in her book that there are definitely elements, but there wasn't a whole lot of things there that would clearly say she was definitely a Christian. And there are some questionable elements. We see that there's things about Indians and African Americans and how they did not really treat them correctly. This is another thing that you're going to have to just talk to your kids about and explain that this is not how we would actually treat these people. But there are some awards that she received. Her first 5 of her books received the Newbery's Honored Award. There's actually an award named after her, and this is the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award in 1954. But in 2018, people started questioning about, do we want an author to have an award that was so questionable with racial elements? So they changed the name of the award to the Children's Literacy Legacy Award. And now we're going to take a look at one of her pieces that she wrote, and I'm going to introduce this book just like I would for my class and read a little bit of this book. Imagine what it would be like to take a trip out west. Maybe you were back in the old-time days and you would have to ride in a covered wagon to get there and travel a great long distance. Well, today we're going to get to take a venture with a little girl named Laura in Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Going west. A long time ago, when all the grandfathers and grandmothers of today were little boys and little girls, or very small babies, or perhaps not even born, Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and baby Carrie left their little house in the big woods of Wisconsin. They drove away and left it in lonely and empty in the clearing among the big trees, and they never saw the little house again. Pa said there were too many people in the big woods now. Often Laura heard the riding thud of an axe, which was not Pa's axe, and the echo of a shot that did not come from his gun. The path that went by the little house had become a road. Almost every day, Laura and Mary stopped their playing and stared in surprise at the wagon slowly creaking by on that road. Wild animals would not stay in the country where there were so many people. Pa did not like to stay either. He liked a country where the wild animals lived without being afraid. He liked to see the little fawns and their mothers looking at him from the shadowy woods, and the fat, lazy bears eating berries in the wild berry patches. In the long winter evenings, he talked to Ma about the western country. In the west, the land was level, and there were no trees. The grass grew thick and high, and there the wild animals wandered and fed as though they were in a pasture and stretched much farther than a man could see. And there were no settlers, only Indians lived there. One day, in the very last of winter, Pa said to Ma, "Seeing you don't object, I've decided to go see the West. I've had an offer for this place, and we can sell it now for as much as we're ever likely to get, enough to give us a start in a new country." "Oh, Charles, must we go now?" Ma said. The weather was so cold and snug house was so comfortable. "If we're going this year, we must go now," said Pa. "We can't get across the Mississippi after the ice breaks." So Pa sold the little house. He sold the cow and calf. He made hickory bows and fastened them up right to the wagon's box. Mom helped him stretch the white canvas over them. In the thin dark before morning, Mom gently shook Mary and Laura till they got up. In firelight and candlelight, she washed and combed them and dressed them warmly. Over their long red flannel underwear, she put wool pretty petticoats and wool dresses and long wool stockings. She put their coats on them and their rabbit skin hoods and their red yarn mittens. And we're gonna have to see what happens tomorrow. Thank you for coming.